Tonight on Nation to Nation, it's all about the latest federal budget. National Chief Roseanne Archibald praises some parts of it, but overall says it didn't go far enough.
Deliberately underfunds us and deliberately keeps us in those cycles of poverty rather than moving us into prosperity.
Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu was a little more upbeat about the budget.
I think what the budget reflects, first of all, is a continued commitment to Indigenous people.
And Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller emphasized economic reconciliation.
That has to be done in partnership with Indigenous communities, making sure that they are part of the consent process, but also part of the wealth process.
Welcome to Nation to Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. The Trudeau government unveiled its 2023 budget on Tuesday. There's about $667 million in new spending on Indigenous priorities for this fiscal year. This is significantly down from what has been spent in previous years. Joining us today to talk about the budget and where it hits the mark and perhaps falls short is Assembly of First Nations National Chief Roseanne Archibald. Welcome to Nation to Nation, National Chief Archibald.
Yeah, thank you.
What is your first impression of the 2023 budget?
I wanted to highlight one of the positives, which is an investment in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and working with families and advocates on advancing the National Action Plan. And I'm obviously very supportive. That's one of my priorities in the second half of my term. The other part of that issue is we have to go further. We need action such as the red dress alert that was proposed by Leah Kazan recently. I'm definitely in favor of that. So we have to move from these kinds of funding initiatives that move a process along, and we have to move into funding that actually brings action to an issue like MMIWG, ensuring that families and survivors see action rather than words and shows of concern. The other thing about the budgetary cycle that I always find problematic is the cyclical nature of it. So First Nations will make submissions on what we need, and these are reasonable asks. We're asking for clean drinking water. That's a reasonable ask. We're asking for housing that is safe, a very reasonable ask. We're asking for infrastructure that puts us at the same level as every other Canadian. Again, very reasonable. And what happens is this federal government turns around and, deliberately underfunds us and deliberately keeps us in those cycles of poverty rather than moving us into prosperity. There's a repetitive injustice against our people rather than lifting us up and creating a more just society. There's a deliberate pattern of lack when, in fact, all of the wealth that is built in this country, now known as Canada, is happening on First Nations lands and waters. And so we really need a new economic deal. We need a national prosperity table to begin those talks. I've been advocating for that from the beginning of my term.
What was the biggest oversight that this budget made?
We have less boil water advisories, but we still have over 35, I believe, which is far too high. That means that children and babies and families don't have access to the basic human right of clean drinking water. And to me, that is a part of what Amnesty International in their report called a national disgrace. The fact that First Nations have to live, many First Nations still live in third world conditions, is absolutely unacceptable in a country like Canada that has access to the wealth that's being built on our lands. We need the new economic deal that makes sure that we have a share of that wealth, which we promised as treaty people. When we signed treaties and made these sacred covenants with the newcomers, we said we would share the lands and resources and the wealth. And what's happening is that the government is not upholding They're part of that deal. And that's why you see the conditions in First Nations that have to change. And that has to come through a new economic deal, because every time we go into these budget cycles, they just chronically underfund us. So we need a new economic deal.
One of the biggest items was a $4 billion investment over 7 years targeting an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I believe we asked for $63 billion, which would bring us up to a level of housing and quality and quantity of housing enjoyed by the rest of Canada. And we were offered $4 billion. So to me, that is like less than 10% of what we asked for. It's not acceptable for this government to make decisions that are creating unhealthy situations for our families, sometimes up to 20 people in a house, multi-generational families living in a 2-bedroom home sometimes. So this government has to do better. And in terms of that Amnesty International report, they are falling behind when it comes to our rights in this country. And, I look at some of the investments that they're making, and to me, those investments are really leading us down the road of assimilation. They're investing in corporate kinds of organizations that really lead us away from sovereignty and away from true jurisdiction to be assimilated into the rest of Canada, like the Land Management Board kind of process that really doesn't respect sovereignty.
You became national chief in 2021, so this is your second federal budget. How much headway has been made in closing the gap between First Nations and the rest of Canada?
Again, these cycles are never in our favor. And these budgetary talks that I have to go through every year are, to me, an indication of what I have previously called performative reconciliation by this government, by the Prime Minister, that we need more than just talk. We need reconciliation. We need to see these promises come to life to close those economic gaps, to bring us to the same level as every other person who lives here on Turtle Island, or now known as Canada.
National Chief Archibald, thanks once again for joining us today.
Thank you. Really happy to be here, Fraser.
Next up, we'll have Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller to talk about economic reconciliation and how it fits into this year's budget. Welcome back. According to this year's budget, the Liberals will be spending $173 million over the next 5 years on what the government is calling economic reconciliation. Joining us today to explain what it all means is Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller. Welcome to Nation, Minister Miller.
Thanks for having me, Fraser.
So I thought I would talk about one of the major themes of the budget, of course, is economic reconciliation. Maybe you could just explain to our viewers a little bit about what that means.
Lack of honoring treaties, the fact that a lot of extraction and a lot of exploitation of lands and resources has been done on the backs of Indigenous people without their participation. So there's a huge aspect to that which deals with righting historical wrongs, making sure Canada is paying some long overdue bills, but also moving forward on making sure that Indigenous communities are part and parcel of the future. We talk a lot about the resources and the clean resources that we need to create in this country to have to combat climate change. And that has to be done in partnership with Indigenous communities, making sure that they are part of the consent process, but also part of the wealth process. So the federal government is responsible for an important chunk of that, as well as the provincial government. And so opening up, having a national dialogue, a national discussion on how those revenues are shared, particularly when we're talking about a critical mineral strategies, which can present a lot of opportunities, but can scare the heck out of a lot of Indigenous communities that think that their lands and resources are going to be exploited once again, as they've seen in the past. is part of what we call economic reconciliation. So the initiatives that we have in the budget are to foster that further dialogue, knowing that the federal government can't be the only player, that we have to have the provinces and territories at the table.
Right, and I noticed there's $76 million put toward helping First Nations develop their own sort of administrative capacity or self-government, but it's still administered through Crown Indigenous Relations, your department. So why not just take this money, if it's for self-government, and allow First Nations to access it themselves and determine how they would like to spend it?
Well, the budgetary process is still one that is run largely by Ottawa. When you look at the self-governing process that we have in place, and heaven knows it's not perfect, but it's getting to a space where it really is reflecting what UNDRIP, what Indigenous communities have been telling us for ages to do, which is to respect self-determination. A lot of those transfers do come in terms of block transfers with wide discretion that we see actually yields better results instead of nickel and diming people and putting them into categories where they have to constantly reapply for program funding. This may seem obscure to anyone who has not gone through that process of applying to the federal government, but probably rings quite true for those who see so much paperwork they have to face as they try just to get governance money, capacity money, simply to be at the table and to be part of, to have these sophisticated conversations with industry or with the government of Canada, or anything they choose to do in terms of how they determine the vision and direction for their own people.
Right, and I also noticed there's money for environmental assessments, or to help First Nations or Indigenous communities participate in these environmental assessments and projects that are on their territories or directly on their land. Again, does this not, though, maybe sort of in a sense kind of undercut the UNDRIP and duty to consult, because that's really the onus is on the companies and the government to reach out to First Nations and to make this happen. But by giving this money to the First Nations, does it undercut maybe duty to consult a little bit?
Well, what we see, and we're in an interesting space and time in our country where we see industry, governments, any player that wants to get involved with Indigenous communities, realizing that they need to do this in a respectful way. But conversely, on the other side of things, you see Indigenous communities repeatedly telling us that there's some consultation exhaustion insofar as they don't have the capacity, they don't have the resource and the personnel. They have all the talent in the world to do it, but it's often people that, since they're talented, they're being asked to do things elsewhere and doing 10 things at once. So building up that capacity is key, because what we're talking about is a meaningful consent process that can't be done if you have well-paid people on one side, and on the other side, sort of abusing the goodwill of the community, or sort of holding them up for ransom and not having the capacity for them to actually participate in a meaningful way with the bright minds that they have at the table and are able to provide, and the meaningful input that they will eventually be able to provide if those people aren't being properly compensated. We've seen this as an explicit example in the area of getting clean water into communities, knowing that we have the capital to get into community, but training the expertise on the ground, equal pay for equal work compared to a non-Indigenous community. And if that's not the case, well, then these things shut down and do not operate at an efficient level. So too, by analogy, in the governance space, especially in the area of consent and governance, where we're moving in a world with a critical ministerial strategy, where that input, that meaningful input, will be key to whether this strategy is actually a success or not.
Right. I notice there's actually a lot of money put toward missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls initiatives and supporting that national action plan. Part of this includes this ombudsperson, or a person to look at the help the government appoint this ombudsperson. I'm wondering, though, if it's just naturally your government's going to face criticism, of course, of the way money is spent, how quickly it's spent, and that. Would you like to see at some point, because Indigenous spending is so critical now, and there's a lot of money and there's initiatives, perhaps maybe something like a parliamentary budget officer or an Indigenous budget officer that actually reports to Parliament rather than that is completely outside of the government of the day, that can monitor some of this spending?
Well, it's an interesting point, and that I think is part of the reason why we're moving with Bill C-29, which responds to 3 calls to action in putting together a commission to oversee these matters and the actual answering of the calls to action of the TRC. But when it comes to murder missing Indigenous women and girls, over the last 2-3 years, there have been a couple $2 billion put in to responding to the final report, which is significant. But what we've heard as well is there needs to be some level of accountability in the person of an ombudsman that would be put forward. And the federal government hasn't moved quickly enough on that. And so making sure that there are these accountability mechanisms with the resources available. We currently have Jennifer Moore-Rattray, who will be reporting to Crown Indigenous Relations as to the strategy to put forward and to get to that ombudsperson. But I think it's a very positive development because it can't be the government, despite the billions of dollars that have been put forward to dealing with this tragedy, which is ongoing, there is a level of accountability. It can't be the government, again, giving itself grades for responding to a tragedy that is in part responsible for. So I think that in the field of those that are on the front lines every day fighting to keep their own people alive, that level of accountability will be a bit of an element of trust that will be able to hold the government, whoever it is, to account in terms of how it spends its money, where it should be advocating more, as well as coordinating with the provinces and territories, which has been sorely lacking in the last little while.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but as always, it's a pleasure, and thanks for joining us today, Mr. Miller.
Thanks, Rudy.
When we come back, we'll have Indigenous Services Canada Minister Patty Hajdu to talk about some of the budget's investments in Indigenous health, housing, and more. Welcome back. Spending on Indigenous priorities may be down in this year's budget, but the government still managed to make significant investments in Indigenous health and housing. Joining us today to talk about these investments is Indigenous Services Canada Minister Patty Hajdu. So thank you for joining us today, Minister Hajdu.
Great to be here, Fraser.
Great. So we noticed that in this year's budget, after record spending in previous years, of course, on Indigenous priorities, it was a little slower this year. I think just in this particular fiscal year, about just under $1 billion. I know there's challenges with the economy and things, inflation. That is this a trend of slowing on Indigenous spending that we can expect in the next few years?
No, I think what the budget reflects, first of all, is a continued commitment to Indigenous peoples, and in particular in some of the structural framing of the spending that's about, for example, the capacity to have a deeper and, I would say, more substantive conversation about resource sharing. So as you know, my colleague, Minister Wilkinson, received some money to do that work of beginning to prepare both communities and the corporate world for more extensive resource sharing with Indigenous communities. You know, we've in budget 2021, $4.3 billion, actually well over almost $6 billion was announced for infrastructure, and that continues to flow until 2024. So that money is continuing to be spent in communities. And I think this year what's really exciting is the urban, rural, and northern $4 billion expenditure in housing for First Nations people, Indigenous people in urban, rural, northern settings, something that Indigenous people have been talking about for a long time. Although we've made historic investments in First Nations communities, we know that many Indigenous people are still struggling in urban settings and remote settings that are without housing. And so that's a huge investment. And then finally, I would say this budget commits in the fiscal framework the $2 billion for the health equity work that is part of the new transfer agreements with provinces and territories, and $2 billion for health equity that's delivered by Indigenous partners. So the commitment continues. We're spending some money that's already been allocated, and we're investing new money in new areas.
Right, and maybe I'll just move back to the housing investment. Now, noticed I had a close look at last year's budget, and I looked at this year's budget, and I looked at the line items. So this is essentially, I think, the same $4 billion that was announced last year. The only difference is it's now being spread over 7 years, and the spending isn't going to start until next year. And so it's actually 2 years after you said you were going to spend it, it's the same amount of money. So why are you re-announcing this money, I guess, and why aren't you building Indigenous homes like right now?
Well, we are building Indigenous homes right now on First Nations. And in fact, many First Nations, although there's still a housing deficit in communities, will tell you about the housing boom that's happening across the country. And whether it's through Indigenous Services Canada money or through CMHC, rapid housing money, I have noticed when I'm visiting communities the new construction. And certainly, of course, we know that there's always more to do. The gap is very large on housing. But urban housing is a particular challenge. And we've been working actually with Indigenous partners partners to figure out how to deliver this money, because what we don't want to see is delivering the money through provincial partners where it doesn't result in the outcomes that Indigenous people are saying they need. It's very specific money that's carved out for Indigenous by Indigenous, and so in order to do that, it does take more time. I mean, we have choices here. We can either decide for communities what housing is going to look like, especially in urban settings and rural settings with partners like municipalities or provinces or territories who may not have the same vision as Indigenous peoples, or we can work more methodically with Indigenous leaders and Indigenous experts on designing a framework for now and that will last into the future. And we've chosen to do the latter because previous work without including Indigenous people has not resulted in the kinds of long-lasting change and suitability, I would say, for Indigenous peoples.
Okay, and I noticed there is, you mentioned the $2 billion, but there's also this sort of $16 million that was spent, that you're spending on tuberculosis in Inuit communities. Inuit Taprik Kanatami says it's only about a quarter of what they need. Why not more money, I guess? Well,
listen, first of all, I hear the frustration on the speed of work. Everybody wants things to happen quickly, and they want it to happen now. And I think, and I share President Obed's frustration around tuberculosis or any infectious disease, because speed matters, and we know this from our COVID experience, actually. The faster that you can support people to get better, the faster you can disrupt the spread. But there's not just, obviously, the spending on specific tuberculosis that will help with that agenda. Tuberculosis is a disease of social determinants of health. So we just talked about housing. Housing is actually one of the factors that can reduce the spread of tuberculosis most effectively. Obviously, people who are sick, they need treatment. Tuberculosis is a difficult disease to treat, so people who are in treatment need support to be able to continue to access and take that treatment. But housing is one of the ways that we can reduce the spread, because crowded housing, as you know, leads to an increased rate of tuberculosis. The other thing I'll say is that we can't do this work without the partnership of provinces and territories. So I've been speaking with Minister Main. Their work on tuberculosis did get disrupted through COVID-19. He's committed to me that he's going to work more rapidly, not just with ITK, but with all Inuit partners, to make sure that the money that is coming, both in the form of the renewed transfer, that the specific tuberculosis money and the housing money all works together to try to reduce the rates of tuberculosis and eliminate tuberculosis from this country. So that work has to continue, and I think what we all need to commit to at all levels of government is that we're going to be very specifically focused on using the new revenue that's available to territories and the $2 billion health equity fund that Indigenous people will be able to direct on the specific issues that are affecting Indigenous people, including tuberculosis in the Inuit.
Okay, well, I could certainly talk about the budget all day, but you'd never make it up to your constituency, or you wouldn't have time to do your podcast, so we're going to have to leave it there.
One day.
And thanks, as always. We really appreciate you coming and making time for us on Nation to Nation, Mr. Haidu.
I enjoyed the chat. Thank you very much.
That wraps up this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.